Good evening and welcome to the Marion Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Michael Grauske and I am one of the Ath Fellows this year. Tonight's panelists, Andre Kluel and Mark Brody, are two leaders in the field of environmental conservation and restoration who will discuss their experiences working in China's largest giant panda reserve, Panda Mountain. Mr. Kluel is a writer, lecturer, teacher, and practitioner in the field of ecological restoration. He has taught classes at Florida State University, owned and operated a restoration company, and is a co-founder of the Society for Ecological Restoration. He is the author of Ecological Restoration: Principles, Values, and Structure of an Emerging Profession, which is used all over the world as a guide for conservation and restoration efforts. Mr. Brody is a graduate of Claremont McKenna's class of 1983, who has done substantial work in the effort to conserve giant pandas in the Wulong Nature Reserve in China. He is a grant recipient from the National Geographic Society and for over 20 years has designed and managed a wide range of environmental programs in China, including the Panda Mountain Reserve. As always, audio and visual recording is prohibited. Please welcome tonight's speakers to the Athenaeum.
I'm going to use this if you want to use this.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Michael. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here. I've heard a lot about the Claremont colleges for years and years and years, and finally I have a chance to be on campus. And even better, I get a chance to tell you about my favorite topic, which is ecological restoration. And I'd like to begin by reading a paragraph out of my book. It's on Amazon. Matter of fact, it's the first paragraph. Ecological restoration is the process of assisting in the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. From an ecological perspective, it is an intentional activity that reinitiates ecological processes that were interrupted when an ecosystem was impaired. From a conservation perspective, it recovers biodiversity in the face of an unprecedented human-mediated extinction crisis. From a socioeconomic perspective, it recovers ecosystem services from which people benefit. From a cultural perspective, ecological restoration is a way that we strengthen our communities, institutions, and interpersonal relationships by participation in a common pursuit. From a personal perspective, ecological restoration allows us to reconnect with the rest of nature and restore ourselves as we restore impaired ecosystems. All of these perspectives on ecological restoration distill down to a simple truth. Nature sustains us. Therefore, we serve our own interests when we reciprocate and sustain nature. So, this photograph is taken on the Tibetan Plateau, southwestern China, a year ago last fall, and just as colors were the tree colors were coming out with the changing season. And we are working in this area here. And Mark, do you want to come up and?
Well, I'll just stand here. So, as introduced, I'm from the class of '83, graduated then. I've been working at this panda reserve for approximately 15 years and have been working in China now for more than 20 years. So there's at least 3 parts to tonight's presentation or discussion. One part is telling a story of a small NGO that I manage, working in China. Perhaps the bigger part is helping you appreciate some of the key principles and approaches used by ecological restoration and recognizing that ecological restoration is a new field. It's an interdisciplinary field that relies upon bringing together both scientists, natural scientists and social scientists. And for us, for my colleague, Andre Kluel, and I, it's a field whose importance and significance in a world experiencing unprecedented environmental change, it's a terribly needed and important profession that we would encourage anyone interested in the environment to pursue or consider. And then thirdly, again, depending upon the time and how our discussion goes, I have some particular interests to describe how I feel ecological restoration and some of the work of our organization can help influence and be part of an evolving environmental movement in our country and the world. And again, the importance of this environmental movement so that all of us, particularly your generation, will have hope. And it's very, very important, you know, whether we think about last night's election for those of us that are in despair, or whether we think about extinction of species and loss of beautiful areas in the world, it's very important that we identify ways in which we can make a positive difference. And the beauty of ecological restoration is usually conservation's very abstract. It's usually the story of stopping bad people from doing bad things. That's kind of been the history of stopping those bad people. But it's rare that when we want to get involved, we have a direct experience where we get to do good things and we get to feel positive that we've made a difference. And that's the story of ecological restoration that we want to share with you, is ways in which all types of people can make real positive change. So let me step out of the way, and I'm going to try to go through quickly just a little bit of introduction to where we work and what's particularly unique about the geographical or ecological characteristics of the area where we work. So very quickly, China is larger than the United States. If you count Alaska as our land area, it becomes somewhat equal. But the continental United States is considerably smaller than China. And what's important to remember is China has the US population, essentially, and then 1 billion people. So, you know, you think the United States is one of the biggest countries in the world, just add 1 billion people onto the total. What's dramatic about China is that this is really, I mean, getting into here, population is sparse. But most of China's population lives in this greenish area, agrarian China, and its density is immense. Lots of China to the north and to the far west, this area here, Tibet, and these larger, higher elevation plateaus, not very hospitable. What's interesting is pandas, all of pandas' habitat are around the Sichuan Basin. This province here is the province of Sichuan. This is where we work in particular. But all of the pandas are in a transitional altitudinal area from agrarian China to the Tibetan Himalaya Plateau. And their primary food is bamboo, and it just exists in this area where it isn't habitable for humans because it's such steep slopes. And if you go further to the west or further to the north, it gets too cold or too dry. So pandas are surviving on a very narrow crescent around this large basin. And so with climate change or other types of land use development, pandas are on the margin. At any rate, I just think it's really interesting because you have different cultures. Cultures to the west and north are nomadic people, Tibetans or Muslim population further into the northwest. And then this is the Han culture, agrarian advanced China development. So the pandas are in a very transitional space. So briefly, where we work is the Wulong Nature Reserve. It's an international biosphere reserve. It's a World Heritage Site. Panda Mountain is not a place. Just to make it clear, Panda Mountain is the name of a program of my environmental nonprofit. And it's also kind of an aspiration to engage people in conservation. So what's special about this place is its altitudinal variation. The nature reserve has 1,000 peaks or mountains that are more than 5,000 meters. On the north west edge of the nature reserve, there's a ridge line with 4 mountains over 6,000 meters, over 20,000 feet. So it's really a dramatic topography area with tremendous diversity in vegetation. What makes pandas live there is that there's this large canopy deciduous forest with bamboo. What's unique is that it doesn't have a killing frost in the winter, so that bamboo doesn't actually die back. High humidity, lots of airflow stops the bamboo from freezing and dying back. So pandas need to eat all the time, and they have a fresh supply of bamboo to eat throughout the winter. All of these things change if there's climate instability. So the main kind of megafauna are the panda on the left, a red panda at the top right, or a lesser panda, that are relatively common, and then leopards are rather rare. But there are a variety of larger cat species within the reserve. So our challenge and the mission of the organization isn't really the breeding of pandas. Most people that work with pandas have been for the last number of years, focused on the care of captive pandas. Our organization is interested in engaging people, both local villagers and visitors, tourists, eco-tourists to the reserve in conservation. So what we're challenged with is fragmented habitat. So you see, you see here agricultural villages. These trees that are yellowish brown, orangish, that's an exotic tree species that has been planted after the area was deforested. The government thought it was a good idea to plant lots of these trees, but what happens is the trees are planted very densely. They shade out everything else. Nothing grows. It's the opposite of biodiversity. It's what some people call a green desert. There's no life. There's no birds. There's really no insect life even. I mean, it just becomes a blank void space. So our challenge is to work with communities. And what's important here is that the work that we're doing is no different than most of the conservation challenges in many protected areas around the world. People have basic needs. Situations are very similar in many parts of the world, whether it's agricultural practices, logging practices, and in this case, livestock grazing. So one of our challenges, both in the nature reserve itself and for our restoration work, is to stop domestic livestock from either eating habitat areas or our own restoration sites. So I'm going to, for the moment, turn this back over to Andre Kluhl, and he'll talk about some of our specific work.
We have 2 different places that we're working, Dongkou down here and Shenshuping up there. We'll start out with Dongkou first. There's sort of a closed valley here. Mark, I do need that. You see the mountains are sort of encircling this valley, and the white line is pretty much the ridge top. And over here on this side, pandas have been spotted in the last couple of years. But they're not over here at all, even though this is good panda habitat. And the reason is you have fragmentation of habitat because of domestic livestock grazing and the conversion of forest into grasslands for grazing purposes. And then you also have villages down here in the bottom, and pandas do not like associations with people, let alone livestock. And so they stay away. And our idea is that if we could just get rid of some of these interruptions, these areas that fragment the habitat, the pandas then would be able to access this entire area. So I designate a 50-hectare area here as our first project site. In fact, we started planting this end of it already. And eventually we hope to reconnect this fragmented habitat. We work with local authorities, staying within the rules. Sometimes it's pretty difficult, but we do our best. This is the project site itself, very heavily grazed, and these few trees that are here in the foreground are planted trees or their offspring. And we don't want those on the site if we can help it. One of the first things we do is to do a baseline inventory to find out what the damage is, what the extent of the damage is, and what needs to be done to assist the recovery of that ecosystem. These are graduate students from 2 or 3 different universities who are helping us. Then we concurrently look for reference sites, ecological sites that are in pretty good shape that will tell us how we want to restore it back to, what kind of forest we want it to be restored to. This is a site right here that's fairly close to our site. We were able to get in there easily, find out what was growing there and other ecological characteristics. So many of the potential reference sites have been cut down for livestock raising. This is an area that we would have been able to get into a couple of months earlier, but they've gotten in there and chopped it down before we could get in. And then so many of the slopes are very steep, very hard to negotiate those. Once we know what we want to plant, we get seeds and plant those. We rent land from local landowners, local peasants, and this helps the economy by renting their land, and we plant seeds on their properties and grow out these trees. And then for site preparation, we go to the project site itself, get local landowners again to put up this fence to keep their livestock out, and then we get in there and pretend that we know what we're doing on the site preparation for the planting, and remove the nursery stock from the nursery that has been in the ground for nearly a year, and take it uphill and start planting it. And our first big planting day was in March of last year. And you're seeing pictures of people, volunteers from 5 different nations there, by the way, doing that planting. And there's plenty of opportunity in Mark's NGO for you all to come to Wolong and help us do this sort of work. See him afterwards. And we were planting bamboo as well. And we got nearly a hectare planted, and we got 49 more to go. So there's plenty of time to be working on this particular project if you do come along. Going back that fall, taking a look at it, the trees were growing. A couple of them got bigger than me, which makes me a grandmother, I think. And a lot of the native undergrowth in the seed bank was coming up. Some fairly spectacular wildflowers just on their own. And that's the kind of work that we're doing. That gives you an idea of what you do on ecological restoration work. Now, I'd like to shift a little bit to the theoretical side and just look at this a little bit more detailed. What is it we're really recovering when we assist the recovery of an ecosystem? And it's the historical ecological trajectory of an ecosystem. Ecosystems consist of living organisms, plants and animals, microbes. They are always interacting with each other and with their environment, and therefore the ecosystems are always changing because of this dynamism. And the change in response to the environment is much greater during times of climate change and other ecological instability. So we're really restoring to the future when we restore. That seems paradoxical, but that's what you have to do when you're doing ecological restoration. And it's really similar to the way physicians heal patients. You know, if you're on a ski slope like this, that's your historic trajectory, and you have impairment, you better go to the clinic fast and get the physician to put on a cast so that you can heal and recover to the point that you can get back on the slopes. But that's a year later, and you're not quite the same person you were when this happened. And so you're dynamic also. You've been recovered to the future. Let's look at this from a graph. Time across here, and these are different states of biodiversity. So each notch up here is a little bit different from the notch behind it in terms of species abundance and species composition. A little bit of change in species composition from one to the other. Not much, but a little bit. And you graph that out, and you'll get a straight line then, as you see here, and that's we call the ecosystem trajectory across time. Now, if that ecosystem is impaired, the trajectory stops until we get out there as ecological restorationists and assist the recovery of that ecosystem in this period of time right here, until the ecosystem has developed back to the point where it can self-organize on its own, and we don't have to be there to help it. Just like you get discharged from a clinic after you break your leg and your leg is healed. And then after that, didn't want to do that. After that, the historic trajectory is reestablished. Let's look at this just a little bit more detail. What we're really restoring are ecological attributes as determined from the reference ecosystem. And these include species composition. The right species is there and the wrong species are gone. The community structure is developing okay. The physical environment is repaired. That means the soil's not eroding, the hydrology is right, all the non-living conditions, and that you have external exchanges. The animals can get on and off the restoration site and into the surrounding natural areas. You have water moving from the natural areas onto your site and so on. Now, once self-organization occurs at this point, then there is a period of adjustment where you've already left the site. You're not doing any restoration yourself. The ecosystem doesn't need it. You just have natural regeneration occurring, and there are more ecological attributes that are restoring on their own. And this includes the ecological complexity, such as the differentiation of habitats and niches, development of resilience to disturbance events, and that allows then sustainability. And that all takes place during this time period here. Now, that theoretically shows you what's going on, but then let's ask the question, why are we restoring these ecosystems in the first place? And this is where it gets interesting and very interdisciplinary in a hurry. We do it to satisfy values that were lost because of ecosystem impairment. And we can use this four-quadrant model here to categorize the different kinds of values. There are personal values, ecological values having to do with biodiversity, cultural values, and socioeconomic values. Take a look at each one of those. Start with socioeconomic values. back at Wolong, we have local people living here, and we've got to make sure that what we're doing is in restoration is going to be helping them. Well, on a regional basis, restoration will help the water supply, it'll retain flood waters, it'll retard erosion, and then more specifically, people can go out and collect medicinal plants from the restored ecosystems, food plants, nut trees, Chinese chestnuts, for instance. They can make fence posts out of some of the trees, and they can get employment of various types. If you have a good restored ecosystem here, it's going to draw ecotourists in, and these people can be employed in the ecotourist industry. And let me shift over to that second area where we're working, in the Shenshuping area, and look at cultural values there. Now, at Dongkou and Shenshuping both, we're restoring ecological values for these people right here, the pandas, by restoring their habitat. So that's an obvious ecological value. Let me just point out some of the features here on the slide, on this aerial photograph. You have this huge mountain here. And then down here, it's all this construction. And this is a new giant panda conservation center where pandas are put in, captive pandas are put into outdoor enclosures, and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people will be coming on some days to see these. And that center opened in May of this year. In that center, in this area here, it's an area where there used to be a Buddhist temple. In fact, this entire area was a village where people were farming up here lower on this mountainside. And all those people had to be relocated in preparation for the Panda Center. But I point out this site because there's a story associated with that. There's also a Buddhist temple up here which is still extant on top of the ridge. You can hardly see it. You have to walk there on very slippery, narrow trails to get to it. Pretty isolated. And then down here is an area that where we put in our first tree nursery for doing some restoration work. Seen from the ground, this is the new Panda Center, and there's that mountainside that's behind it, and the entire thing needs to be restored. You have all these planted forests there, and that Buddhist monastery that's extant right now is up here on the mountaintop underneath those trees someplace. And it's quite a hike to get up there. Now, with all the tourists that are coming in there, we will have kiosks in place where we can be teaching about ecological restoration to tourists. And those who are interested, we take them to our nurseries. Here's one nursery that's being planted right here, and here's some of the officials looking at our nurseries. And the tourists that we take to the nurseries will be able to purchase these trees and take them up on the mountainside, and we will show them where to plant them and how to plant them. And they will have a first-hand experience actually planting nursery stock and being becoming ecological restorationists. This is a very hands-on way of teaching a lot of restoration and the importance of restoration to a wide variety of people from all over the world. And it will raise their ecological literacy. And that is a cultural value. Education is a cultural value. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to use restoration to restore cultural values or to improve them. This, here's where we're telling the managers of that particular Panda facility what we're doing. And we had a ceremonial tree planting a year ago in the lower photograph there. Now, I mentioned that this area was, this Panda Center at Chenxuping was once a village. About 250 people roughly had to be moved out of there, and then down about a kilometer downhill into government housing, which is rather nice over here. Mark, this battery is running out on this thing. I need your magnetic personality on this.
I can just jump around and point.
Okay. That'll be a great event. Anyhow, there's one place over here where they put in a big facility, and they had to take out the Buddhist temple that was associated with that village. And in its place, the residents there have come back and put in this little shanty down here and made it into a temple site with a lot of prayer flags on the tree. Now, the government built them a new temple, but they never use it. Up on the mountain, this is the monastery that's up on the mountain. It doesn't look like much, but it's got all the Buddhist accoutrements inside. And this is the Lama who runs the place. And I asked him if once all the people who would be, well, see, we'd be employing a lot of the people who used to live in the village in the restoration program. And I said, to ask the Lama, would you be willing to designate the entire area of that mountain as a sacred, Buddhist sacred site? And he said, sure, be glad to. And so what essentially we're doing is restoring restoring the ecosystem and also restoring Buddhist culture. And this has a lot of meaning for the people there. It reunites them with their traditional homes. Now, I got to jump to Florida to show restoring as a personal response to environmental crisis, a personal value. Tampa, Florida was the place of the Super Bowl back in 2009, and a lot of people were flying in from all over the country, and the aircraft were putting an awful lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The tickets that you bought for the Super Bowl had a premium on them to mitigate that damage to the atmosphere, and that money was used to grow seedlings of mangroves, which these volunteers here are shown planting those seedlings to take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, these people were feeling a personal response to environmental crisis that their culture was causing. You see, all of us, I think, feel that in one sense or another, particularly those of us who are in the environmental field, that we gain so much, so great advantages for living in our society. But we know darn well that this is coming at an environmental price. And so we want to do what we can personally to pay back some debt for the advantages that we're getting. And it's this kind of work that pays back that debt, the personal response to environmental crisis. And also there are other cultural advantages that come up every now and then. This is a picture of a wedding. A couple met and wed as volunteer restorationists at a restoration site near Chicago, and And here they are getting married at that site. And so, you know, if you want to get married, become a restorationist, okay? Let's go back to China. Now, let's talk a little bit about climate change. Here we're up the road a little ways, that area that Mark was telling you about earlier, where the peaks are getting up around 6,000 meters or so. And here's tree line right here. And this is coniferous forest, and above that is an alpine grassland. And it is really damaged ecologically because of too much domestic livestock raising. These are yaks, which have just stripped these mountainsides down. Now, there's good data that shows that tree line is increasing in elevation in this area. It's slow, but it's happening. That coniferous forest is eventually going to start climbing up here into and invading into this Arctic or this alpine grassland, coniferous forest like this. And so one thing you can do, if you want to restore to the future, you can restore this alpine grassland fine, but you maybe in this spot right here, you put a cluster of seedling trees of these spruces and firs, and maybe over here another cluster of them. Not too many, just a couple of spots. And you let them grow, and maybe in 60 or 80 years, they've finally gotten to the point where they're producing seeds in abundance, and that's about the time that this area the climate is going to be warm enough to support coniferous forest. So then what you've done is to pre-adapt this restored ecosystem to that changing climate condition. This is how you restore to the future. Look at this on the graph. Here's time A right here. And at time A, you have a particular suite of species. Here's time B a little later, and you have another set of species. You have a lot of the same species as A, but a few new ones too. So here you have your original ecosystem. You get impairment because of too much grazing by yaks. You come in and restore the area back to grassland, your time A species, and also time B species, the coniferous forest. Put them both back in there. Now, there's an awful lot of work to be done around the world in ecological restoration. Let me just show you a few of the really big projects that have been initiated. The Bonn Accord of 2011, world leaders assembled and decided to restore 150 million hectares of degraded and deforested lands by the year 2020. They better hurry. Only got 4 years to finish that up. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity, consisting of 174 nations of the world, signed on to restore 15% of all degraded ecosystems of the world by 2020. Essentially, these are the same targets, just different ways. The UN Convention to Combat Desertification adopted policies that include large-scale ecosystem restoration. And the New York Declaration on Forests of 2014 adopted a policy to reduce natural forest loss around the world by 2020, reduce it in half by 2020, and end it by 2030. Okay, for that, all that work to be done, we need a lot of people who are doing ecological restoration. So, you've got opportunities to get into the restoration profession. And I've been very fortunate to be able to go around the world and do training workshops, different countries, trying to get people ready for this. And it's been very satisfying kind of work. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you to take us out.
So I mentioned that we were going to talk about three things. Some of the, thank you, I don't need that though. That we were going to talk about work of my organization at this particular place in China, that Andre Kluhl was going to introduce principles of restoration. I might, just in terms of thought process, I'm going to lay out a couple of ideas about the ways forward with restoration. And then I'd like to have as much exchange as we can, either asking questions of any type, we can go into more depth, but I did want to save a consequential amount of time for questions. So for me, the way forward, and I think it's, again, we all want to have a sense that we can respond to an environmental crisis and make a contribution. When I say we all, I think that this notion of being a global citizen carries a responsibility. We need to do more than kind of be bearing witness. We need to do more than simply inform ourselves and be aware of this loss. And, you know, for myself, I've gone through various stages of life of being a very idealistic student, and creating an NGO early on in life, you know, fighting the good fight, so to speak, becoming a parent. And one of the most poignant things for me, and I've always felt this, but when I saw it in my own, had it come back to me through my own child, where I've done restoration on my own land where I live in Wisconsin. And I have a daughter that's now 14. I think she was probably only 7 at the time, something like that. But we were driving from the countryside where we live into not a big city, but the city of Madison. And so we were leaving the countryside and we were moving into an urban area. There was quite a bit of development and sprawl. And she very poignantly said, I love nature. And then she had this big sigh and said, after she exhaled, and it keeps going away. And she had this sense in her own life of seeing loss of nature. And it was about the same time that I was becoming increasingly involved in restoration. And I recognize that for all of us, when we hear about the loss of species around the world and we're asked to contribute to environmental causes, I would very much like to see the next waves of conservation really engage people and give us a chance to feel good about our actions. And there's many, many organizations that are doing this already. Certainly in the United States, there's many examples of restoration work parties. I know that here, as part of the Claremont colleges, there's a couple plots of land where students are actually doing research and doing some restoration nearby. So these things are becoming increasingly common. But one of the things that I'd like to, and I'm in discussion with some of the administration and professors here at CMC, is one of the things that's most exciting to me is through my own odyssey and development of thought and personal experience, I'm proposing the creation of a social enterprise where the idea is we engage people in the act of conservation of restoration on public lands in the United States. And through the teachings and principles that Andre Kluhl has developed and the people within the Society of Ecological Restoration, that we spread the practice and help people understand ways in which we can kind of rechart this trajectory and that we begin to restore to the future. And certainly, as we begin to look and take seriously issues, there's a complex matrix of issues, whether it's climate change, changing land use, scarcity of water in the West. And for me, my concern is if there is a loss of or lack of public investment in public lands, if agencies that manage public lands face further budget cuts, if there's a move towards privatization of public lands, how are these public lands going to be cared for? And so I'm very interested in thinking of innovative ways. And it's already practiced, but it's practiced more with a little less rigor than I would like. But there are friends groups. There's many friends groups of different types of parks. But the idea is to really invigorate that process and make these friends groups become essentially something like, going back to the time of the Great Depression, you had the Civilian Conservation Corps in the United States. There's ways in which locally, with smaller land areas at a community level to larger scale U.S. Forest Service lands or national park lands, that if we're facing significant ecological challenges, we're going to need to get more people on the land to be acting proactively and restore to the future. And I think as we look for ways to build community, ways to give ourselves hope and restore ourselves, for those that have participated in a conservation work party or have done something for a given species, we're losing butterflies at an alarming rate. If we all got out and planted milkweed plants, whatever it is, just to know that we can help butterflies survive a little bit longer, it defeats that sense of despair that my daughter had, where she said, I love nature, but it keeps going away. I want us to realize there's things that we can do to bring nature back. And so to me, that's very powerful. And it gets beyond the complaining, gets beyond blaming the bad guys. And then we all get to be those, the kind of superheroes we'd like to be. So I don't have any, I can blabber endlessly. I'd love to answer any questions either about my work in China, ecological principles, or the sense of ways in which ecological restoration can be a unifying, hopefully inspiring process to support environmental work. Are there questions? Do you want to say something? Add on to this? No. Okay, so we're here to respond to you. If somebody either speaks loudly, you've got a mic to share, okay? So please, anyone that has a question or a comment, please let us know.
Hello, it's such an honor to hear you and have you visit the CMC campus. I'm a junior here at CMC, and my question is a little bit about this environmental movement that you spoke about in the last segment of your presentation. Would you say it has been reflected in the Paris Accord at all? And how has restoration been represented internationally?
I'm sorry, when you said the Paris, you mean like the Convention of Parties about Climate Change recently?
Mm-hmm, exactly, of 2015.
Do you want to answer that? I can try. Yeah, okay. So it's a good question, and again, just repeating or framing the question is, with the world focused on the crisis of climate change, most countries in the world acknowledge climate change. We are, again, an outlier. The United States is probably by far and away the climate denier of the planet. So Professor Kluhl showed you that slide where just in the last, from 2011 to say 2012, 2014, there is a wave of international organizations under the UN banner and then other coalitions of governments coming forward looking at the urgency to restore what we would largely say the biosphere. So those initiatives are happening in response to concern. Let me just finish one thought. So they're happening in response to concern about climate change. The Paris activities were really more about limiting the rate of growth of pollution. It wasn't really so much, but there are many international initiatives that are coming forward. And what we're really challenged with is finding funding mechanisms to make this happen. And I can touch on that, but I'll get to, go ahead.
There are two different mechanisms at play by doing ecological restoration. And the one that everybody thinks of is that you're growing trees and you're growing permanent vegetation, which are storage areas for carbon dioxide. They're absorbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in wood, in roots, in plant parts, and in humus. That's easy to understand, but there's another one that's very important, and that's that mature vegetation, particularly forests, but other mature ecosystems, cause a very efficient thermal reflectance of solar radiation. Wow, that sounded pretty good, didn't it? In other words, sunlight is reflected back up into space again by this mature vegetation. That means the world isn't heated up in the first place. And so we don't have to store the carbon.
So I mean, there are different things. I mean, one of the challenges we could talk about is funding mechanisms, but maybe there's other questions. I just want to get, before I digress, I'd like to just answer more questions or comments. Again, if somebody has something, again, if you have a comment about the talk, feedback, something you feel is important.
Thank you. I was wondering in the, okay, here we go. Donko. I hope. Oh, okay, cool. I said it right. You were talking about how the pandas weren't, I guess, able to get to the other side of the valley because there were people living in between and stuff like that. I know that you were working on like restoring the environment there, but do you have a plan for how you want to get the pandas to move to that other side of the valley?
I think I'd like to answer that in a broader response. So the greatest problem for wildlife around the world is this issue of fragmentation. It's not like all habitat disappears at once. It's like it's there and then it's gone. It's that it's constantly kind of being nibbled at. And so particularly for pandas, they tend to have a home range. They have their carved out territories. And what's happening for pandas and other larger species is they each have a pocket of territory that they use, but sometimes those pockets are no longer connected to one another. And so we talk about connectivity. So one of the great challenges is how do you have wildlife corridors? How do you allow this flow? And part of the restoration challenges are these external exchanges. Do you want to jump in? Okay. So I think rather we can talk about, you know, a specific idea there, but the point of restoration is you don't have to fix everything. What's really important is you hold on to some things, and wildlife will do a lot better. It's just like a migratory bird. They need to have resting points along the way. There's flyaways, there's estuaries. So we've become pretty sophisticated in being sure that animals can move across a landscape. And so restoration is part of that process of understanding how to help animals move across a landscape. So the same issues and challenges you face there are things that we have to replicate. And so our purpose or goal is to have educational learning opportunities that are transferable to other animals, other places.
Is this working? Oh, boy.
Now you can talk and not even have to.
Oh, yeah, I can interrupt.
Yes, good.
We interrupt each other all the time. Standing joke. Pandas are extremely reticent animals, and they're pretty much solitary, or very small groups. Therefore, when you find one, you might not find another one. If you have fragmented habitat, and there's only one panda, it's pretty hard to get for them to reproduce. And even if there are 3 or 4 or 5 pandas in a particular area, and this applies to birds, butterflies, you name it, plants as well, you have very few individuals, and they tend to interbreed with each other. And it's, you know, like mating with people in your immediate family. You get these recessive genes that become homozygous and deleterious to the offspring. And the offspring get weaker and weaker as the generations go on because of the buildup of this genetic material. And so you get this outbreeding depression as it's called, and that's why species go extinct. Therefore, we can, China came up with this great announcement that they had found more pandas in the wild a year ago than they had for the previous 10-year census. And there was a blurb about, by conservationists, the IUCN in particular, that now pandas were no longer in danger. They could be referred to as just threatened because there were more of them. That, we do not agree with that at all, because the pandas are in these small populations where they are subject to outbreeding depression and can go extinct in a hurry. That's why it's so darn important to restore fragmented habitat, so that you don't have, so that you have these animals can go from one area to another easily.
I'm not sure we answered the question of how they're going to move across the landscape, but if we're putting back disturbed, degraded land into a natural condition and we're minimizing grazing, then they have a much easier time moving across the landscape, and the landscape's a lot friendlier for them. So they're more likely to use certain corridors. And so and this is part of the process, is that China's very clear that fragmentation's a terrible problem, but they're just declaring areas as protected, and they're restricting activity. So one of the big themes for restoration is it's not enough to limit human activity anymore. And if you think of Kluhl's model that shows it takes direct human intervention to restore, you've got to go through this process of restoration and then have this natural regeneration process. So most of environmental legislation, most of environmental action has been restricting behavior, restricting actions that are supposedly degrading. The problem is the degradation's occurred, and the systems in many places won't self-regenerate. They won't fix themselves without now constructive human intervention. And so there's a tremendous opportunity for people to engage in this type of targeted action to reset kind of these natural processes in motion. And that's where I think, for the most part, there isn't enough government action, and there won't be enough funding, and there won't be enough people power unless there's public participation in these efforts. There's a question on that wall.
So I have a specific question in terms of, I like your approach, kind of taking the public and create awareness and involve everybody, and especially local people. But I think one of the core issues, and that's more from a governmental perspective, you have to, in the first step, I would say you have to conserve the soils, because if the soils are gone, restoration can't go back to the original ecosystem. And there's many examples in Europe, like where the Romans 2,000 years ago cut down the trees, and if the soils are gone, and you find a lot of places, especially in southwestern United States, where you have the same thing. And the big question is, who is stepping in between until you motivate local people? Is this, in your opinion, a task which has to come from a federal government, or is this a thing where NGOs or international organizations can step in?
The answer to those questions are yes, yes, and yes. We all have to step in. First of all, realize that we don't want to do restoration. We would much prefer to preserve our habitat. We're only doing it because habitat is impaired, and it's impaired to the point where it's affecting our values, and so that's why we're doing it. As far as who initiates a program, one thing that's developed in certain parts of the world, like Australia fairly well now, is a stewardship program where people from local communities will really value their natural resources, their natural areas, and will go out and literally take care of them. And for instance, in Europe, you mentioned, you have the chalk meadows, the hay meadows that people revere. It's where poets went out and composed sonnets. And these are really essentially sacred areas. They're iconic areas for people in Europe. And people will go out there and with old-fashioned scythes and actually cut down the hay to maintain the habitat the way it had been back several hundred years before. That kind of stewardship we need all over the world. We have some of that going on in the United States. So that's where local communities can be going into public lands, and usually your managers of public lands are going to say, yeah, we'll take your help. We need all the help we can get. And they'll really foster a stewardship program by the local community. But in other instances, yes, you do need more oomph. NGOs sometimes provide that. They do a lot of that in Australia. Sometimes the public agencies, public governments themselves will do this. National park lands in this country, for instance, initiate restoration programs, and as well as sponsor stewardship programs to take care of intact ecosystems once they were restored or if they were never degraded in the first place.
I would like to briefly also answer that any type of assistance, public or private, is going to be required. I think the magnitude of challenges is going to outstrip our capacity. So, and that the type of response that may be most appropriate will have to be devised for a particular location. I mean, the important thing to recognize is that there isn't going to be a universal fix, or it's not the one approach will get it all done. I think one comment I'd like to make is that particularly in the third world, where you're dealing with local communities that are reliant on the resource, and in China's case, they're so eager to bring in development. I mean, one of the greatest threats in the western part of China is China wants to eradicate poverty through tourism. And so tourism can be a tremendously destructive force for indigenous or local culture, leading to modernity and all kinds of changes, rapid changes. But what they haven't figured out or haven't in any way utilized is, and I think this is part of where I believe the public resource agencies, the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service, out of necessity in time will need to move as well, but particularly acute in the third world, is that tourism activities to natural areas has not yet engaged people and organized visitors to participate in conservation. I mean, most of us go to a beautiful place, we camp, we take pictures, and our form of recreation is kind of an aesthetic, that we take in these lands for our own spiritual recreation, relaxation. I think if you take that notion of being civically engaged and recognize that these lands are in peril, and we change some of that to more of what I might do to contribute, and create the sense of a conservation corps where people are physically going onto the land, either as a tourist or as an active volunteer, and doing work and paying for their time in these protected areas to do conservation and restoration work. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for, we would call it service learning, other types of engagement programs. And that's something that I'm hoping would be a way to spur greater conservation action.
Let me pick up on one thing that you said, which will answer another question that has not been asked yet. You mentioned that this is really a spiritual process, and it is. When you're out there working on a restoration site, day after day after day in this glaring sun, and you know, it really gets rough. And let's face it, those plants don't grow that fast. You ever try to sit down and watch a plant grow? It takes a while. But after you've been out on a site 2 or 3 years, usually, it becomes a time when all of a sudden you realize, gee whiz, look at those plants begin to grow over here, and look at that bird coming in here and nibbling on those seeds. And you begin to see that ecosystem develop under your tutelage, and you get this marvelous, amazing feeling that you are part of your own ecosystem. You are part and parcel of that ecosystem. And let me tell you, that is a profound spiritual experience. And so there is a real payoff personally doing ecological restoration to get to the point where you have that experience. So thank you for the question.
Hi. So you guys talk a lot about preservation and restoring to the future. I was wondering, how do you restore for a conservationist future? How do you choose what sort of corridors, wildlife corridors to pick, assuming there's no changes in animal spirits or spirituality, no one cares in the future, and China keeps wanting to disrupt the environment? How do you choose where you restore for?
That's in. I've never had much choice on where I restore. An opportunity appears, and it's usually a matter of somebody hands you a check and says, "We're going to fund this project," and you do it that way. Or you go onto public lands as a volunteer, and the BLM manager or whoever it happens to be says, yeah, we need some work over here, start working here. You don't have that much choice, at least. And then what you do, as you're working, you do everything you can to attract attention to yourself. I know usually those of us who are naturalists tend not to be flaunting ourselves around, but we have to at least let the media know and let our friends know what we're doing, and try to build up interest in our restoration projects, to develop a community interest so that the community actually psychologically buys into the project. And a good way of doing that is every now and then, and certainly at the end of a project, have a public celebration. Get a keg of beer, get a band, get a soapbox for a politician, and announce it over the internet and on TV, and make sure that the sun's going to be shining nicely that day, and have a celebration. And you know, that ties your community. You get communities tied together that way. People unite. They begin to realize that this is special land that you've been working on, and it's their land. It might belong to the Forest Service, or it might belong to some private property owner, but nonetheless, there's a psychological buy-in that you can get there that way. And so you're trying to do that as well. You just, in other words, you pick projects where you have the opportunity to work, and you then publicize it and try to get the public buy-in on it. And by doing that, you also then have the opportunity to do public education. You have a Sunday school group coming in of middle schoolers, and you can raise their ecological literacy by, they're out there working on the site, they're gathering seeds or whatever they're doing.
This is when I want to interrupt Andy, just so you know.
And am I stealing your thunder?
No.
Okay, anyhow.
I want to.
Well, just let me finish this. You raise their ecological literacy and really get them interested in this. And let me tell you what I do. I try to get an organization going of youths and get them out there on a regular basis to a project site. But the only youths that I allow to get into my organization are the sons and daughters of county commissioners. Now you have some control, and you're going to have some chance to develop some policy circuitously to get your restoration done where it's going to do the most good. That's
Before I add on to anything, is there another question or comment? Because I'd like to maybe respond, but I'd rather have a new question or comment from the students or anyone here.
So you talk about engaging the communities, and I was just wondering, because you're doing this all over the world, has the language barrier been a big problem for you guys in the past?
Well, very briefly, Andy's training people around the world. Professor Kluhl.
Yeah,
I'm working in China, and so we have organizations and networks that we work with, and it is a challenge as things move a little slower, but it's not a fundamental problem, at least from my experience. That's not the biggest challenge or a consequential one.
I'll give a workshop wherever somebody gives me an airfare, I'll go.
But
That's
yeah,
what I've done here.
But the translation is typically not a problem, and often much of the natural scientists tend to be well educated and bilingual.
You spoke a little bit about ecological literacy. So having trained in all these different locations, what sort of background do you think is most favorable for really imbibing that ecological literacy? Is it cultural values or specific like political regulations or the education system that prepares people to actually imbibe the most knowledge?
I have those 4 quadrants in that model up there: personal, ecological, socioeconomic, and cultural. I think that whenever you do a project, you are fulfilling values, at least one, maybe more values, in each of those quadrants. I don't think you can get away from it. It can be that, or usually a project is done with particular goals in mind, and those goals are in a given quadrant. For instance, it's often for improvement in the delivery of natural services, flood control, things like this. But while you're doing that, you're getting your personal fulfillment as a practitioner or as a benefactor on that project. You're also providing an increase in biodiversity. There might be some cultural input as well. I mean, you're increasing ecological literacy and so on. So usually there are specific goals, 1 or 2 goals that are mentioned for a project, but you're actually fulfilling values in all those quadrants.
I think a large part of a project's success really does take a champion, and so it really varies from place to place, and that champion can be from a group of farmers to a person that has that's a political leader. So I don't know that there's a singular solution, but what you end up needing is you do need to reach critical mass, and one of the hardest things is that we maybe haven't emphasized enough is it's really critical that you identify stakeholders that have a longer term commitment, because, you know, much of our society is organized around election cycles or very short time frames, you know, whether you're looking for a return on investment, but most of society's kind of investment reward analysis, kind of what am I going to get out of it if I put X in, is on a very short time horizon. In most restoration projects, you know, people don't typically think on a 20-year time frame. So I think my advice would be figure out who has a vested interest in the long-term benefit, you know, what those longer-term benefits are going to be, and who's going to be an institution or an entity that's going to be around 15 years from now to hopefully continue and sustain a project. Is there another question? Because I'd like to come back to the, I want to take other questions, but there was, I think, an important, I don't know your name, but I think you raised, you know, an important issue. Are there other questions, or? I'm going to jump in. So he was asking about, you know, how do you make a choice? How do you choose a project? And, you know, which animal do you? So I think in my mind, one should never really be animal specific. I think that's, you always think of the broader habitat or ecosystem context. Do you want to comment on that? Do you?
I totally agree on that. The whole point is, in the legislation, you have the Endangered Species Act.
Yes,
and
that's right.
That's
That's
kind
right.
of,
But let me continue just for a moment. So I'm saying, I think, you know, people rally around megafauna or charismatic animals. So I think the challenge is, I'm in it for the ecosystem and the restoration purpose. But the other question is, and I think conditions are going to be severe enough in some parts of the world that our restoration efforts, or we would use the word, often the word would be rehabilitation efforts, are going to be driven not about what's right for the animal, but what does this community need to survive. I think that if we talk about communities in the Southwest or areas that are arid, that have lost soil, if we think about large areas in arid Western United States that are experiencing unprecedented wildfires, how are those wildfire areas going to regenerate themselves if climate conditions are changing, and if they have been severely damaged through excessive fire? How do they, you know, how are they going to restore themselves? So I think some of the questions that we face right now as like a conservation biologist is it's almost like a luxury. We may 20 years, 30 years from now be really focused on utilitarian issues, and so lots of these decisions and methodologies that we develop for land management as effectively as we can are probably going to be driven towards what was called ecosystem services, so that landscapes are managed in a way that they provide this socioeconomic benefit for society at large, water retention, these things. So I think the equations are going to change if conditions get bad, and I think it will take political leadership and commitment over the long term. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think those are issues that we need to be getting at. That gentleman wants to jump into.
Let me just make one comment there. When I restore, I'm much more concerned about getting in the common species of the ecosystem, because those are the ones that are going to provide the ecosystem structure and the productivity. And you have to get that in first. And the last thing you think about is getting the habitat for that extremely rare species. That's the logic you have to take in restoration.
And we'll have time for one more question or comment.
I just want to say, I mean, I totally agree on that, and I would say the first point might be to reestablish processes that we get the development you showed up there, and also thinking about disturbance regimes and stuff like that. However, if you look on the side from, if you think about a top-down approach, if you don't have a local community who is saying and identifying a problem which we ultimately have to solve in a certain time frame, you mostly, in most countries, have to think that you come by one single species, and that's a hard time to argue with farmers, for instance. Whereas if I say, hey, I want to stop erosion there, normally you have the people in the boat. The question is, how can you do that to policymakers who normally like to have simple maps, and if you just have one species, you can produce nicely colored maps which are turning from red via yellow to green and show the development, but that's based on one species. How do you do that for processes?
I think that's a wonderful question.
The question is, again, on what time horizon? I mean, lots of these things are going to be driven by, will there be an understanding that many of the challenges we take will take considerable time to address or remedy. So there's lots of, whatever we say, literacy, there's lots of things of, depending upon governments, whether they're going to listen, whether they're going to be receptive and willing to look on an ecological or environmental time frame as opposed to a political time frame. That's going to be another big challenge that we face. Again, I think, are we at the time, Michael, to stop? And so if anyone wants to ask more questions or visit, I'm here. Professor Klul is here, so we're not running away if you wish to talk more with us.